So really curious. So 1955 started counting breeding populations of ducks, wetland conditions. What happened before then?
And you can see the count. Anybody can download it. The 10 most abundant ducks. What used to be the 10 most abundant ducks. Let's put it that way. They haven't changed it, which is frustrating.
Where, like this year, it's relatively dry. There's not a whole lot of ponds on the landscape, and when there's no ponds, there's nowhere for a duck to sit. And they're not, they're territorial. They're not going to just pack into what's remaining.
But if a duck hunter had 30 seconds with a congressman or a senator, and they had 30 seconds to talk to them about why the BPOP and all these other surveys are important, what would you have them say? Welcome to Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. I'm your host, Joel Brice, and today we're tackling a big one, the controversies and conspiracy theories around the annually conducted waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. This joint effort of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Canadian Wildlife Service has meant that every year since 1955, duck hunters get the numbers. Mallards are up, pintails are down, widgeon are steady, wetlands are either dry or booming. And there have always been a few doubters out there, but it seems like every year we have more people calling, emailing, and commenting on our social media with statements like, "There's no way they can accurately count all those ducks. I hardly saw any last year. It's a lie." So today, we're going straight at these concerns with two of North America's most clever and knowledgeable waterfowl scientists, Dr. Frank Rohwer, Delta's president and chief scientist, and Dr. Chris Nicolai, Delta's waterfowl scientist. We'll dare to ask, how does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually count waterfowl? How much do we at Delta trust in this process? And what would happen if the survey disappears? Big questions, and we've got big, bold answers, along with a few surprises that you won't want to miss. So without further ado, let's get started. Frank Rohwer, Chris Nicolai, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
Excited to be back.
Well, had you guys on this podcast 2 episodes ago. We were talking about duck distribution. This particular podcast is going to be related to that. It's kind of embedded into some thoughts and concerns that duck hunters have been bringing to us. We're going to talk about the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. We're going to talk about some of the background, what it is, what it isn't, some of the reliability, and just kind of relate it to some of the comments that we've been hearing from duck hunters about iffy duck seasons in the fall, and then kind of drawing some concerns or skepticism to the spring counts. You guys ready for that?
You bet.
Oh, for sure.
Me too. I appreciate it. Chris, you're the waterfowl scientist is your title. Frank, you're chief science officer. A couple long-term Delta folks here. Before we get into it, though, it is early May, and Frank, it just baffles me at times. I don't really think about duck or goose hunting right now, but you're taking off in a few days to go take a couple days off and do some snow goose hunting.
Oh yeah, I love going up to Manitoba and trying to get a few snow geese to eat or a lot if I'm lucky. So yeah, it's marvelous. I don't do the spring turkey thing. I concentrate my effort on geese. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't even think about it. It's like those early goose seasons. My in the fall, August or whatever, my brain hasn't switched over to that yet, and I'm thinking mosquitoes. But yeah, right now you're right. People are out turkey hunting, walleye fishing, other types of fishing. But so you're heading up to Manitoba.
Yep.
Describe that real fast. Like, how long are there huntable numbers of geese available?
You know, it's interesting. Manitoba has a problem like many states. You just referenced our fall goose season that starts August 15th to try and regulate giant Canada geese. They're doing the same thing in Manitoba. So they actually start a giant Canada goose season in March, and it runs till April 10th. So I've already been up twice trying to
really
get some big Canadas, and then the snow geese usually arrive starting mid-April, and they'll stay until the middle of May in some years. So it's a ton of fun, and they're amazing numbers, and sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes they're way smarter than I am, and I get nothing. So it's a ton of fun. I love an area in southwestern Manitoba. Whitewater Lake is it's a wetland of international significance, and it holds a lot of birds. So it's a neat place.
Do you want us to bleep that name out?
No.
You okay with that?
Yeah, anybody can go there.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, switching to you. You've had a big change big addition in your family's life. Litter of pups.
Yep. Yeah. Whole is my 8th litter of dogs, so pretty exciting. But yeah, this is my 6th generation of this group of dogs. So yeah, lots of groundwork, lots of driving my dog to go meet a stud and bringing her home and all the tests, and it finally paid off. So yeah, we got 9 pups at home.
That's pretty neat. You brought one in today, the one you're keeping.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
I think it's kind of I've been hearing to do kind of some office dog trivia where, yeah, pups, they don't have their eyes open, but I didn't know this. You said their ears are closed too?
Oh yeah. No, it's pretty fun. We've had a ton of friends come over, biologists, outfitters, all these people that own dogs, all these high school friends of my kids come over, and it's amazing how few people really know much other than buying an 8 to 12-week-old pup that's basically a mini dog when you get it, right? And they show up and their ears are flat back and there's nothing. There's no hole in their ears. It's completely closed up like a cauliflower ear, and eyes are shut and everything. But yeah, they're 12. They should be opening up maybe tomorrow. So that's a lot of fun.
Did you know
I
that?
didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
I had a litter of puppies.
But what's really cool, like I found a really good stud dog. Yeah, I drove all the way over to Wisconsin to go meet the stud, or take my dog to go meet the stud. And yeah, this dog's, all pointing, all this kind of fun stuff. So it's really cool. They're starting to really get moving on their legs. They're not just doing the army crawl anymore. They're actually up and wobbling. And it's me or when the mom comes into the whelping box. I mean, they are just heads up and they're looking right at us with their nose and just come on wobbling over.
So they can hear now.
No.
Still can't hear.
I'll stomp on the ground. I've been testing, banging and doing all this. They don't do anything. It's so crazy. All they are is a nose and suction and a digestive tract right now. It's pretty cool.
Keeps their world small so mom knows where they're at, I suppose.
Yep.
Well, that's awesome. Well, good for you. And it was cool to see one of the pups in here today. Tiny, absolutely tiny.
Yeah, but it's cut into mine like turkeys. I've tried a little tiny bit this year, but I put in for turkey tags before I did the breeding. So, we were waiting for it all to start. So turkeys have taken second fiddle. Snow geese. Actually, I did go out snow goose hunting. I forgot a couple times with my very pregnant dog. But otherwise, yep, the walleyes. I can catch walleyes 3 minutes from my door. And it's been an excellent year.
Frank, you're not a fisherman.
No.
Yeah.
Not enough patience.
Just give me the ducks, right?
That's right.
Little pheasants. You're known for pheasants, too.
Yeah.
Well, good. Guys, we have the right people here. Just to jump into it, first couple sections here, we're going to talk about the BPOP, as a lot of people call it. The Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey takes place every year. Fingers crossed, right? But people call it the BPOP. So we're going to talk about what is it, where it came from, how it's conducted. We're going to talk about the significance of it later on, and then just kind of get into some of the concerns and looking for your guys' perspective as scientists. And Chris, you've actually done these surveys in the past. Frank, I don't know if you've done them in the past or not. You've not?
Nope.
No, me either. But we're going to get your guys' take on the accuracy, and is this something that we believe in, that hunters should believe in, and hunters should champion their existence. So, with that introduction, Frank, what exactly is the BPOP? What exactly is the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey?
Well, let's go backwards. And in any wildlife management, particularly when you're doing harvest, like we have for ducks for decades and decades, you really need to understand what population size is and how it's trending. And so we long ago figured that we need to count ducks. And counting ducks on the breeding grounds seems like a big job because it's huge. But on the wintering grounds, you have these incredible concentrations, and they move. Ducks are incredibly flexible. And you can have 200,000 ducks in a square mile, and they can be here one day and 3 days later over there. So you would have to survey the entire wintering grounds to get a total count. Whereas on the breeding grounds, because ducks spread out, it obviously made sense to count breeding ducks. So, but it was such a huge area. If you just take the prairie pothole region, where we think anywhere from 50 to 70% of the ducks come from, that's still an area bigger than the size of Texas. Imagine trying to survey all of Texas. So they realized, one, it's huge, and it's hard to count ducks from the ground. And so long ago, there was a very influential waterfowl guy named Frederick Lincoln. He helped us identify great wintering areas for ducks, identify areas that should be national wildlife refuges. And he was also a pilot. And he said, we need to count ducks from the air. Now, it took a long time for that to happen, but after World War II ended, and obviously aircraft had, advanced dramatically, a bunch of folks said, yeah, we should do this from airplanes. And interestingly, Fish and Wildlife Service folks came to Manitoba and worked at the Delta Research Station with, for instance, Pete Ward was by then the scientific director, and he was an old pilot from the war, and so he helped Art Hawkins. You had a variety of people come up and say, this is how we should do these surveys, and they practiced and figured out, yeah, we can fly long transects. We go from east to west, so keep the sun out of your eyes in the morning, and count ducks on a narrow strip that's long. And so, they set up what you referred to. Nobody in their right mind calls it the breeding population and habitat survey. Is too long.
You have to read that.
So we call the BPOP or the May surveys, because they're mostly conducted during May. And we set up these long transects, and by 1955, everything had been standardized. Now, we started in the late 40s, but it took a few years to figure out how to do the counts. And we've had the same transect lines in the mid-continent since 1955, and have run the surveys every year. This is the largest wildlife survey that's run annually in the world. And so it's a pretty cool thing that we have really an amazing data set. So
it kind of amazes me. I think of all the innovations and cultural changes post-World War II, but the BPOP does have some of the... I was doing some reading, and that post-World War II, you had a bunch of trained pilots who were really good at flying at low altitudes, and probably the availability of airplanes as well. So it does have some of that early origin there. So really curious. So 1955 started counting breeding populations of ducks, wetland conditions. What happened before then?
Yeah, before then we didn't have anything systematic, and in fact it was mostly probably the best thing you had to indicate the population was the Ducks Unlimited had what they called key men, and these were folks in regions that would go out and report, yeah, it's a great year here in Gainsborough, Saskatchewan. Got a lot of wetlands and a lot of ducks, and that was sort of the extent of it. It was a very qualitative thing, and frankly a little haphazard, and that is no way to try and manage something where in the 50s we thoroughly believed that harvest had a big impact on duck populations, and in the last 40 years we've clearly said harvest is not that important.
Well, keep in mind too, when were the flyway councils set up? They were like the late 40s themselves, right?
Yeah, and so you didn't have this call for great
exactly.
data sets. So
So it was just a few. What you call them, key men?
Key men is what they were called. Yeah, and they were largely Ducks Unlimited folks that went out and said, "Here's what we think is happening in our area."
And I've got a copy. I think I got 2 copies in my office. But if people are interested, there's a really neat book. Was put out in the early 90s. That Flyways book. You should be able to find it online, but it's maroon, this thick. But a whole bunch of the pilot biologists and others worked together to put it together. Some really neat stuff. Old guys that have been long gone, Fred Glover, Cal Lensink, Jim King, all these guys with Lincoln that, they put this all together, and it's a really fun read, I thought.
Well, the other part of it that's impressive is the the extent of the resources. People, agencies, who conducts it?
It's a joint effort. It's officially the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Canadian Wildlife Service, but you have a lot of state waterfowl biologists that are very involved, because not only do you have the trained pilots that are flying Fish and Wildlife Service planes, but you have a trained observer. So when you fly these surveys, and the survey transects can be very long in some regions, they can be up to 150 miles long. And you have the pilot counting ducks on one side of the airplane. He counts out to 200 meters, and the biologist in the airplane with him counts on the other side of the plane out to 200 meters. And 400 meters, in case you're not metrically inclined, that's a quarter of a mile. So we count a quarter mile strip for 150 miles or some distance. And the pilot, because he's flying the plane, only counts ducks. The observer counts both ducks and ponds. Now the pond counts, you mentioned, started in 55. That's not actually correct. And for some reason in Canada, they started them systematically in 1961. And in the U.S. side, which is a little surprising, we didn't start until 1974. So if you look at the data that comes out every year, the big survey results, you can trace wetlands back on the Canadian side to 61, but 74 for the U.S. side.
So what's the 55 number then? 19?
55 is when we first started counting ducks. So at first we just counted ducks, and then we realized, wait, we really need to quantify ponds, and particularly on the prairies. In other areas, ponds don't change much. When you go up to the boreal forest, it's rare for a pond to be wet one year and dry the next year. But as you know, in the prairies, water fluctuates, and so I hunt in southern Saskatchewan. 10 years ago, I had at least 11 large ponds in one little rural municipality. Now there are none. It's that dry. I can't even hunt there. There's no water. So,
right. And think about those boreal and tundra areas. It's more water than land.
Yeah.
They're impossible to count.
Yeah.
You're just going, and where's the boundary?
You couldn't enumerate ponds because
it'd be one.
Yeah. One long pond,
Well, so we've talked about, the history, where it came from. Frank, you'd start talking about some of the details of the mechanics, but I don't think that we've truly set up the extent, the geographical extent. So some of these questions, I know the answers to them, but I'm not going to tell you which ones are which, but there's a bunch. I don't know the answers to these, so I'm kind of leaning in like I'm hearing some of this for the first time. But the geographical extent, Chris, of the survey, traditional survey area. But I'm also curious why. Like, how was all that identified?
Well, keep in mind, too, this is serving a regulatory component as well, for opening duck seasons and modeling harvests and populations. So you got to count. This is a survey that is originally designed for mallards to catch the most important duck in North America. But then in 1990, they started modifying the eastern survey area, which is east of the Ontario-Manitoba line for the most part. And then they really changed it. They finalized it in 96. But then also keep in mind the Western Mallard model was stepped up not that long ago. And that one's different, where they're bringing in a bunch of state surveys as well. So you got California and Oregon being used just like all these federal surveys. Like Minnesota does a duck survey, but it's not used in this regulatory process. Washington, I helped with Nevada, and it gets different. So, it's changed. So you're going now with the Eastern Survey all the way over to the Atlantic provinces, the Maritimes, and then you go up through the prairies, and things stay pretty constant. And Frank was talking about these long, straight transects, but then you hit the mountains. And all of a sudden, you can't fly these long lines anymore because there's no point in going up and over the mountains and counting mergansers and harlequins, maybe. And so there you get all these like amoeba-shaped valley floor counts. California has them, Nevada, Oregon quite a bit. Alaska, you look at the TSA for Alaska, and there are these funky shapes with lines that are uniform, but some are long, some are short. They really vary. So it's pretty cool how you got to respond to the geography.
Sounds like a crop dusting plane, just a little short.
Yeah. I've flown with crop duster pilots before. They're a little nerve-wracking.
Except the plane has to have a high wing. You can't
Yeah.
see out of a crop duster because they're low wing.
Right.
But yeah,
Just the flying.
Yeah.
Not the plane.
Yeah.
But so it starts. So basically, the eastern Dakotas, western Minnesota. Frank, you want to describe kind of the geography?
It generally starts in the southern part of the range because obviously mallards start nesting earlier. And like Chris said, it was timed largely around counting mallards. So it's not a great count for scaup because scaup are late breeders. And so we're always worried that we're counting scaup in the middle of migration. But you start May 1 in the Dakotas and then you move north, and it generally takes almost a month to finish the prairie part of the U.S. and Canada. Then you start in the boreal, typically around the 20th of May or something like that, and that takes a long time, maybe even earlier, the 15th, and goes to mid-June. And so, and then in Alaska, God, you don't.
Alaska, they're actually pretty close to the prairie stuff.
On average, I think they start mid-May, but it, you've got different pilot biologists that are going to different regions, and here's the tricky part about the survey: you fly this long survey and you count ducks, but what we really have to do to make it even remotely accurate is do the visual correction factors, the VCFs. And what that means is you take a segment. Okay, we mentioned transects can be 150 miles long, but a segment is only 16 miles long. And what we found out when we got new money from the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and NACA, we didn't change any of the survey lines. Those are established in 55. What we did is we greatly increased the number of segments that we count on the ground.
Okay.
So you send a ground crew in, and they go out on ATVs or walking, and they flush ducks and count them. When you're flying, at 105 miles an hour at 100 feet or more, it's easy to miss ducks. Now, some ducks are easier. Drake canvasback sitting out in the middle of the pond, we have visibility correction factors that are really low, like often 1.5. Mallards, they're even harder because some of the time the Drake mallard is sitting in the cover, and we often only count males. So it's messy, but we assume that any male in a group of 4 or fewer is paired. And you can't see his hen because she's on a nest already. And so 2/3 to 3/4 of the mallards we count are, quote, indicated pairs. That means we just counted a male. Okay. Now imagine you get down to green-winged teal.
Yeah, and cinnamons are even worse.
I don't even want to think about them, but green-wings hang out in the cover. And so you can fly over a pond, and particularly if the density of ducks is high, man, you're going to not see the green-wings. So that's where the ground crews will correct. So you see 10 ducks from the airplane in 150 mile, but on the ground crew, if they counted, they would have seen 150, and so you have a visibility correction.
I would assume that the ground crews are always counting more.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And
so the correction of the segment is then applied to the transect.
And what's interesting is you have to do those every year because it very much depends on if you have a wet year and the water is into the cattails or into the cover even beyond the cattails. Well, you're not gonna see many ducks.
On the prairies, they're done every year. Yeah.
And in the boreal forest,
they did a helicopter survey back in 91,
and we take the
developed
averages.
Numbers, and they ran with them now. Yeah. They use the same numbers up there every year.
The ponds just don't vary that much. But on a dry year, when there's cattail, then there's mud, and then there's water. Well, imagine, you see most of the ducks. So,
right,
and there are fewer ducks. So,
yep.
Are there any other types of aircraft, or is it just airplanes?
Yeah, we use helicopters in the eastern survey area.
Yep, there's portions over there for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then, you're going into the extent, and think about the number of people, too. So you're talking 12 survey crews. That's a pilot and an observer, usually Fish and Wildlife Service people. But as Frank mentioned, every now and then, there'll be a state guy that'll hop in that right seat as well. And then you got the ground crews. So in the U.S., you got the Eastern Dakotas, Western Dakotas, so 2 and 4 respectively. And then this is the one place where CWS gets involved, at least for the TSA, where they actually have 4-person crews for each prairie province that goes around and does the air-ground, the VCF correction for us, and that's the partnership there.
I've heard, attending Flyway meetings and things like that, that consistency and participation is obviously desirable. If you're going to train somebody up every year with a fresh set of eyes, you'll end up with different trends in interpretation, and someone's a better counter than others. What are some, like, I know the second we start listing, we're going to miss a pile, but are there, like you said, state biologists in addition to federal, provincial?
State guys are pretty, I bet you there's some years there's none. It's really driven by the Fish and Wildlife employees, counters, stuff like that.
Okay. Chris, you had told me before the podcast that you had actually participated in these surveys, and I thought it would be kind of a neat opportunity for you to kind of maybe just describe, like, so let's say you're flying on a transect. How do you record the data? The other part too, we didn't touch on this. Yes, it's the breeding population, but it's also wetland conditions. So what is it like on a survey?
Yeah.
How are you recording data? How do you count wetlands? How do you count all those types of things?
Yep. Just as a caveat, I only was in the plain in the western surveys. I did the air grounds in the prairies as well. But it's fast. And then keep in mind, too, as Frank mentioned, the wetland conditions are only recorded annually in the prairies.
Right.
Okay, so that's the only place where the right seat observer is counting ducks and wetlands. And it's neat, getting ready for this podcast, I made a few phone calls to folks that are out, the BPOP's already started. And it's pretty cool. I didn't know for counting the wetlands, they're actually using tallywhackers. So here these guys are sitting there flying with the headset, counting ducks. But then they got tallywhackers. One tallywhackers for the artificial wetlands.
What's a tallywhacker?
The little clicker.
I can't listen to you until I hear what a tallywhacker is.
What would be a good description? I see, like, some guys down in Argentina will have one for clicking how many doves they shoot. Or, God, I run into snow goose hunters that do it too. But
just keeping a tally.
Yeah, anything. I mean, could be, I don't know, work for the highway department, how many cars are going by. It's an automated machine that you keep pressing a button every time you have observation.
Okay.
So you're sitting there, bam, 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 bam. Oh, drake down, or solo blue-winged teal, pair of mallards, click, 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 click. Canvasback drake, all this stuff. And it wasn't that long ago they were actually using tape recorders. Wasn't that long ago. Then you had digital recorders, which made it better. But then a guy up in Alaska, Fish and Wildlife Service, Jack Hodges, actually put together a laptop program that ran in DOS, and he had it all hooked up where this was actually revolutionary. Every time you clicked the recording device, it grabbed a waypoint, which was really cool. So now it was telling you exactly where a pair of mallards was counted, and then you'd let it go. Press it again, Drake Blue Wing, let it go. So every recording had a lat long associated with it too, which got our data even better. And then now they've got it all, there's years when you were the right seat observer, you're also making sure the laptop computer and its connected GPS units for each one and the headsets were all working. And now they've got them all with a really neat, smartphone apps. It's getting better. And then you still spend your evenings, you've been flying all day for 8 hours, and now you got to be back in the hotel room, eating dinner and then proofing your data. Doing all this because you're turning stuff in the day you get done. Someone was with me on a phone call with Fred Rutger once. No, we were down in Louisiana a while ago, and he was saying back in the day, they'd actually have to get on payphones and call data back. This wasn't that long ago to give real-time updates.
What's a payphone?
Exactly.
Just kidding. No. Wetlands, though. How do you count the wetlands?
When counting wetlands, one of the things they did to keep it simple, as Chris pointed out just a minute ago, they treat artificial ponds and natural ponds differently. And they only count seasonal ponds and larger. So, in the spring you'll often see a field and it has sheet water in it, or there's a temporary pond. They don't count temporaries or sheet water. So they're just counting seasonal, semi-permanents, and permanent ponds. So, and basically because you're cruising in an airplane flash, you can't do anything complicated. Right. You can just say it's wet or it's dry.
And the rule always was, if it's bigger than a king-size mattress and is going to last about 3 weeks,
really?
is what's going to count.
I could do that.
You know, and it gets really interesting. You know, one thing that was neat for me in 2013 was the last time I did the prairie counts, and it was a very wet.
Super wet.
Yeah, that's when Bismarck flooded, Minot flooded.
Yeah.
We were here for it and everything, and it was coming from the west where I was really used to rice fields. There were places we'd be driving on grid roads, and it's a square wetland.
Yeah.
Because it was flooded from grid road to grid road with no drainage.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, you know, if we would have been here last year, that would have been 20 unique ponds. And now it's 1.
So in super wet years, you can get something weird where the pond count goes down just because ponds merge. There's so damn much water on the
Consolidation,
landscape that 3 ponds became 1 pond because the water is overlapping. So
Yeah,
it's a
because
little
it's not like you're looking at a map
Yeah.
of where the wetlands are. Because, if it gets dry, 3 wetlands can consolidate into 1 big wetland now, or vice versa. You know, one that you mapped could just split into 3. So it's complex. That wetland stuff, you know, a lot of things are constantly in flux. You know, better ways to count ducks, better ways to enumerate this. You know, the group with Fish and Wildlife Service is always looking for new ways to refine this. Start using some of these more frequent remote sensing stuff is
There's a
really
group right
exciting.
now that's tasked with, we need to modify this thing. Hasn't been modified in decades, and there are lots of changes we could make. It's a great survey, don't get me wrong, and waterfowl people, like, imagine somebody that works on you know, Lapland's longspurs or chipping sparrows. They have nothing even close. Okay, the BBS does, you know, the breeding bird surveys, but this is such a step above that. It's truly amazing. But there are lots of ways we could make it better, and we're actually working with a guy that's focused on this stuff and really wants to help the Fish and Wildlife Service. A brilliant young biologist, Dr. Thomas Reike, out at Montana, and he's got tons of ideas about ways we should really be improving the survey. If nothing else, just the way we analyze data. You know, we count, and you go and you do this count, as Chris pointed out, we're segregating all these ducks. And you can see the count, anybody can download it, the 10 most abundant ducks, what used to be the 10 most abundant ducks. Let's put it that way. They haven't changed it, which is frustrating. Ringnecks have taken off. When they first started, ringnecks were probably 500,000. Well, they're now approaching 3 million, and they've replaced lots of ducks. But you can't get the ringneck data. You have to actually ask the Fish and Wildlife Service for the data. But anyway, you can see the data, but these data are all treated completely independently. Well, that's kind of crazy, you know, because they fluctuate in sync. I guarantee mallard and gadwall numbers go up and down depending on when the prairies are wet and nest success is great or terrible. And so there are new analytical methods that could pull the data together and not treat them independently and give you much better, more accurate measures.
That makes sense.
But, you know, that's one of the things that you need somebody that's, I couldn't do that. I don't have the math skills. Thomas Reike and Todd Arnold can do that.
Right.
You know,
Well, and you got to set it up right. You know, like Todd uses an example all the time for like band reporting rates. You got to, making changes is painful because when you do something different, did the number change because of this new method or because of system change? You know, and like, for example, you know, the band reporting rates, we changed, the HIP program came in, and then we changed the inscription on bands. So you got to, when you make changes, you got to be incremental, and you got to be able to correct for that change.
Right.
So change is slow and methodical and hopefully very well thought out.
Right.
Yeah, otherwise, you lose the continuity of
Exactly.
the data and your ability to
Right.
compare. Just super curious, living here on the prairies like we do, you know, the surveys are conducted during a snapshot in time.
Right.
The week before, it could have been dry as heck. The week after, it could have been wet as can be. So are there ever attempts to deal with weather anomalies or anything like that?
It would be so hard. I mean, it's exciting, you know, talking about all the partners in this. You know, Mike Anto over at USGS, he's got some really neat data, and we have it out west too. That water for breeding waterfowl, the way it's delivered has been changing over time. You know, out west it was really driven by mountain, you know, winter snowfall, and now it's more spring rainfall. Here, it's happening as well, where our winters, we don't have the snowpack that we used to have here as well. And for many years now, we're getting these really wet events in like late May and early June, where like this year, it's relatively dry. There's not a whole lot of ponds on the landscape, and when there's no ponds, there's nowhere for a duck to sit. And they're not, they're territorial. They're not going to just pack into what's remaining. But, there's been discussions the last few years that this rain comes back, boom, where'd these ducks come from? And not always. And it's not the same high density because they've already, done this. The ducks, as they move through, they're doing this reconnaissance, seeing what it is. And if it's thumbs down, they keep moving. If it's thumbs up, they settle. But if they already went by and then the thumbs up comes up, it's too late for them,
But you can have some, like Chris said, you can have these strange weather events where we had a fairly dry spring a couple of years ago, and then it rained like crazy. And so we had better duck production than we really expected based on the May surveys, what they counted. The habitat looked poor, but actually a week after, they flew the airplanes and counted from the ground, boy, got wet, and
Exactly.
it was actually a good duck
That's what's
production.
really cool is the moisture wasn't good to influence the settling distribution. Settling distribution was quite poor. They weren't here. But like you said, those rains come, and all of a sudden the distribution of the number of ducklings, brood survival goes up. The quality, the forage quality goes through the roof. So those few ducks made a lot of good ducks.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Well, so let's go further down the funnel. So we've talked about the history and this great survey and who does it and where it's done and how often, annual. But what do we do with it, Frank?
Oh, it's the key driver for setting harvest regulations. Duck numbers and habitat conditions are the drivers for setting harvest regulations, and that's what the Fish and Wildlife Service does when they set frameworks. The frameworks come out to the flyway, and so they tell you, for instance, in recent years we've had an abundance, year after year of 60-day seasons and 6 ducks in the mid-continent, and that's what the survey is designed to do. So in other areas you have longer seasons or shorter seasons, but if for instance, if this prairie drought continues and duck numbers continue to fall, we could easily be in a 4 and 45, or even something more restrictive like 3 and 30. Now, a lot of hunters out there have no idea what I'm talking about when I say a 30-day 3-duck season. But when I first went to Louisiana in the early 90s, we were in 3 and 30, and so we had a 30-day duck season and 3 ducks, and that's what the feds set, and then the states get to choose what 30 days they want. But it's the feds that are regulating the overall, trying to regulate the overall harvest. So.
Timelines. So let's look at this year's surveys.
Oh, interesting.
May, June, surveys take place.
Right.
How are those data collected during those time periods used to set regulations? Hit me with the timelines, the announcements, what
used
season?
To be wickedly short. And so, remember, we're still doing surveys up in the Arctic and in the Boreal in Alaska, well into June. And yet, we had to come out, and flyway meetings in the old days were in July. And so the feds had to have all the data in, have it analyzed, and come up with the frameworks that they were going to propose to the flyways by mid-July.
And think about the early seasons, too, that are earlier than what you think of for a normal duck
season.
season.
You think a duck season starting if you're in Louisiana in late October or November.
Plenty of time.
Hell no, they start September 1 in a lot of places. And so you're talking about a process that was incredibly restricted, and it was a huge strain on the feds.
Well, and keep in mind, too, a lot of regulatory processes changed in the same time. All of a sudden, you started to have comment periods and all this, and the regulatory red tape made it impossible.
Yeah. Now, remember, anytime the feds propose a regulation, you're supposed to have a long period for you to comment.
Mm-hmm.
It's typically supposed to be at least 90 days. Well, there was no way you could have 90 days if you're setting regulations in July and it's going to take effect September 1 or earlier. Right. So it was always a stretch and always difficult for the feds. And then remember, we had this big change. It started in 1975 when a guy named David Anderson reanalyzed all the banding data and said, boys, you've been doing it wrong. And frankly, we don't see a relationship between harvest rates and annual survival. Well, that started this huge debate where we changed our thinking about waterfowl harvest. And we now believe waterfowl harvest has very little to do with annual survival rates and population size. Population sizes are driven by what happens in the 3-month breeding season. Wet or dry, lots of predation, low predation, good brood survival with lots of water, poor brood survival in drought years. And so we had this terrible restriction, made it hard to set regulations by July, and we had 30 years of data saying hunting really doesn't matter. Remember, we've lost so many hunters. I'm sure you've done podcasts on hunter recruitment. We've lost so many hunters. So it became clear that we could set regulations a year ahead of time. And so we didn't have to have this mad dash. And so now the survey data comes out typically the middle of August. Well, that gives the feds a whole nother month to figure out here's what the populations were, and then you set regulations actually for next year.
Right. So I think that was like
fall
2013
meetings.
when that SEIS process where it was admitted we can't meet these deadlines anymore. There's a lot of regulatory issues were the hiccup. And so all of a sudden now they got 12 months added to this regulatory process by going. SEIS is what, supplementary environmental
impact statements. So that's jargon.
We're actually talking about a podcast where we do nothing but just like whip out these acronyms and just kind of define what they are.
That's a very big legal component, which there's a lot of analyses. Can we do this? What's going to be the cost? How is it going to impact seasons? And then it was implemented, and that's where we're setting next year's regulations with this year's data.
So that's been how many years now where we're setting a year?
I think it was 2013.
It's been a bunch of years.
12 years.
We've been in this thing for 10 or 12 years. So
okay, so
imagine if you're a state, it makes your life so much easier. You're here in North Dakota and you're wondering, how do we tell the public when duck season is? Yeah. Because we haven't actually heard until July, and we're going to have people shooting Canada geese and
vacations, all that kind of stuff.
Everything.
So May, June counts. August results.
Right.
And that's a big thing here.
There's more to it than that. And you got to keep in mind, we always say there's 3 stools in duck management. You got the BPOP, you got banding data, and you got harvest surveys. So I'd say BPOP is the initial one. Then you got banding is going to be August and September. And then you don't even have harvest surveys till probably those numbers, coming from the wing bees, April in a good year. They're not finalized for much longer. So just think of those 3 data streams and be able to use them. It's not even realistic, especially with that harvest survey, because that's after the season. You're not setting it up pre. That's the result.
So I'm going to see this. I'm going to dig in. I'm going to see this one to the end. May, June.
Yep.
Results in August. It joins the other 2 legs of the stool. And when are hunting seasons for the following year announced?
At what levels is the question? Because you got federal and state.
Well, federal.
Federal, those frameworks, those are going to be, correct me if I'm wrong, those are going to be discussed at the spring meetings.
Well, typically they get started in the fall.
Yep,
so it's started. September, and then they're finalized in spring. But it's way early compared to what it used to be. Right. It used to be July 15th, and now in September they're already considering them.
Yep.
And
they got a pretty good
feel. And then they finalize them again at the next meeting. But
and then after that, you got all the state commission meetings. All the discussions, like the pintail stuff was a big. Yeah. It wasn't finalized, I know, in California until maybe just 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So is it? Yeah, and that just happened just a little bit ago. Anyway, that's a whole nother subject. Frank, 'cause I just think it's important for duck hunters to understand the timeline of this process. Real simple terms, start me in May, end me with the next year's duck hunting regulations.
So you start in May and you do a count, and that count will set next fall's hunting regulation.
Right. But then
it used to set this fall's hunting regulation.
But May, June, but the public
Yep.
hears about the results of that survey in August.
Right.
That starts more kind of flyaway regulatory early discussions in September,
That's right.
and they
But that's
conclude the
remember that's
following
for
spring.
the next fall's
Yes.
hunting season.
Yes.
So the August
Proposed regs.
the August reports are really about hunters getting a sense of what they're going to see this fall. They already know that their hunting season is going to be, we've known for some time we're going to have a hunting season here in the Dakotas of 6 ducks and 60 days. But we want to kind of know, well, the counts are way down, so I might not have my hopes up as high as if we had, twice as many ducks. So, and that's what we're seeing recently is duck counts are way down from those super wet years of 2011, 12, 13, 14, when we reached record high duck counts. And those record high duck counts are one of the reasons that some people are skeptical. So,
Gotcha.
Yep.
Gotcha.
That's
okay.
a different subject.
That is a different subject, but
skepticism.
but it is good. So
Yep.
no, this is really good. I really appreciate this. COVID years, the survey didn't happen.
Right.
So, Chris, you've pointed this out around the office. What's the default state of hunting seasons? Like, is hunting season just defaulted open all the time, or is it defaulted closed?
Yeah, so Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the whole regulation that regulates take of migratory birds, it's closed until it's open. So you got to go through this whole process to justify, the abundance, what we've been taking, what proportion we're taking, and then feed that into a harvest strategy, optimizing those data streams to say, okay, we're going to, the Secretary of the Interior signs off on these the recommendations to open duck season.
So under normal situations, without these surveys and other inputs, there is no duck season.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's
Yep.
that important. What happened during the COVID years where the surveys didn't take place? What allowed duck seasons to turn on then?
Basically, they used modeling data to say, here's what the population has been, and here's what it is very likely going to be. And they improved it a little bit, I believe, using some habitat metrics. Like we can look at the prairies and know it's wet or dry without having to fly airplanes over 150-mile long transect lines. So they use that sort of data to say, look, we're in good shape and we can skip the surveys.
We're going to
for this
project it, but
Yeah.
we've all probably seen these. When you project into the future, your measure of error gets bigger every more year that you're adding to it or that you're not adding to the data.
Right.
So you knew with COVID, we could do this Band-Aid, but it's a temporary Band-Aid. And luckily, it only lasted 2 years. If you would have gone a little further, this wouldn't have worked. So that's when you start thinking about the long-term stability about these 3 data inputs. It gets scary.
Some people are, we're quite worried about the business that we used this spring's count to set next fall's population. So we could have a strange, like we know coming up into this fall that teal seasons are going to be shorter. Teal seasons are either, 9 days, 0 days, 9 days, or 16 days. Well, we went for years and years having them be 16 days. These are the special teal seasons, largely designed to harvest blue wings because they migrate so early. And so this will be the first year we've had a 9-day season in a long, long time. Well, that was based on last year's data. And I was sort of dreading what happened if I shouldn't say dreading. No waterfowl biologist ever dreads having a ton of water on the prairies. But if we had a ton of water on the prairies this year, blue wings can come back. They'd breed like crazy. And we'd have more blue wings flying south than we have in years. And yet we'd have a 9-day season. Now that's not going to happen this year because it's dry as heck. And so maybe it's a good thing. Who knows?
I guess that's I mean, hearing that.
Yeah.
Frank,
Dry as heck down here. We got to give Canada a thumbs up.
Yeah.
Isn't looking too bad right now.
Yeah.
Well, hearing that, Frank, though, it sounds logical.
Yeah.
Like how can you bet
Yeah.
on next year's conditions? That doesn't seem like a super responsible decision.
But again, we go back to harvest is so unimportant in the big scheme of things in terms of regulating duck numbers.
True.
That it's we could. I shouldn't say this, but we could probably skip a year every now and again. Many of us thought we were going to skip this year because of what's happening in D.C. and layoffs and so many restrictions on what federal folks can do. And so it's a tribute to the service that they're actually pulling off the surveys this year.
We're pretty nervous. I started hearing, they
I absolutely thought we weren't going to.
Yeah, they did the bald eagle survey. They did the crane survey. I'm like, and that's after they got their credit cards yanked.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, they pulled this off, and things are sounding good. And all our friends, they started arriving last week. There's people are counting ducks today.
Now it is a treaty. It's in the treaty, as Chris said. You gotta manage this resource responsibly, and that means surveying populations. To set regulations without surveying populations is nerve-wracking.
Yeah, I feel like I want to take a bit of a devil's advocate approach here, and maybe just kind of test this conversation a little bit. It's been going on for so many years. Kind of asking a question without waiting for the answer. How many years have there been surprise counts, like something that we expected, something completely else was measured? So what would be the harm in skipping years, filling in with models? Is that, or pick the argument, or it's really important for it to be done every year, and this is why.
I think that's where we're at with some internal Fish and Wildlife Service, reviews of what's going on. Like we were mentioning earlier, a lot of this really neat remote sensing. So if you have a lot of these population dynamics with this, 70-year data stream, and we got a lot of correlations that it's water that drives the system, maybe there is a chance to start using these long-term data streams from remote sensing and let that be the driver. So there's ideas out there that people are testing before we make a big change.
We also know a lot more than just the simple story. It's water that drives the system. We know water really impacts where ducks settle. We know that water in prairie habitats is a lot more important to ducks. And interestingly, an old Fish and Wildlife Service guy named Johnny Lynch wrote a really influential paper on this in the 1950s. And he said, look, water on the prairies means a whole lot more than water in the parklands. So Chris just mentioned that, we've got study sites just east of Saskatoon, and they're wet. They got good water up there. But wait a minute, the nest success up there is always 4%. We worked on beautiful pieces of habitat last year, and it was less than 1%. Well, the ducks that go there aren't really producing a damn thing. And so it's water on the prairies that's most important, but the GIS systems can tell you that really elaborately. Now, hell, they're meter by meter, and that's way more accurate than we need. But we could probably get by with less. Now, how much less do we want to go
testing it before we implement it?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose some of the best testing then would be to do both.
Yes.
In a year. Mm-hmm. Compare remote counts to actual
Which has
counts.
been going on. There's a really neat guy out west, Pat Donnelly, that's been doing this, and Fish and Wildlife Service as well. But, these GIS wetland gurus that are bringing in all these same modeling stuff, like Reiki brings in. It's really cool to watch these guys, just like, wow. It could really change things if we take some increments and learn along the way.
It's encouraging to know. I mean, having been in this wildlife field for 30 years or whatever it's been, the theme is always do more with less.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that we're necessarily advocating for skipping years but hey, if we're tapping into the realist in each of us, it's probably best for us to start testing alternatives, gap years, things like that, rather than just be forced with losing it all together or keeping it fully intact.
Doing it this year because we did it last year isn't always the best answer. So I'm glad there's curiosity and, wanting to invent a better wheel.
Yep.
And that's the whole process that keeps going.
You guys, there's something, I just want a clarifying question. The pond counts, you said they're in the prairies.
Yes.
Do you mean not the parklands?
Oh, no.
Or do you mean the prairie pothole region?
We often say just the prairie pothole region, and that includes prairie and parkland, which are split about equally. And the parklands are different. They always had trees, clumps of trees, and apparently they've always had higher predator populations because nest success in parkland habitats is almost always much lower than in prairie habitats. So. But we count both, yes.
Okay, yeah, that's one of the things that we're guilty of sometimes with
right.
prairies. Does that mean PPR? Or does that mean literally the prairies? Yeah, there could be a whole nother podcast about the parklands. But as the listener, you may have heard Delta or read in our magazines that for hen houses we target the parklands. Two reasons.
Yeah.
Terrible nest success, more drought resistant wetlands.
Right. Yeah, a hen house in parkland and prairie habitats, when it's dry 3 years out of 10, isn't producing anything, and that's rare in parkland habitats. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't help but think if the more stable the water, the more stable the predator community. Plus, you have a more dominant avian community.
Yeah, I have to believe that's correct.
Probably why you get down to that 4% nest success. Yep. So one of the things that I think that we haven't gotten this far into it, and we haven't addressed this one. The BPOP is an index. It's not a census, right? Like, it's not an attempt. Can you describe the difference in that?
In the wildlife world, we go from an index, which means that we don't know that it is close to the actual number, but we think it tracks the actual number. And then we go to estimates, which we think might be close to the actual number. And then a census is a complete count. Well, we don't have a census of anything. We probably haven't since, trumpeter swans at Red Rock Lakes, when we thought those were the only trumpeter swans in the world, and we knew that there were 35 of them, and it was a crisis. And then, of course, we discovered there are 5,000 in Alaska. Pilot biologist finds them. So the May surveys is certainly an index, and it may actually be an estimate. If it's an estimate, it's on the side towards the index.
Okay.
Because remember, this is the largest survey in the world, and there are lots and lots of transect lines. And in the 40s and 50s, when they set it up, they recognized that, hey, look, when you have an area that has 100 pairs per square mile, that's about as good as we do on the prairies. You put a lot of survey lines there because that's a real important area. And when you have an area that has 20 ducks per square mile, you put 1 or 2 survey lines in that region. So the jargoning term is it's stratified. And so if you look at the map of these transect lines, there are lots of them in the prairies where pond densities are, often 130 ponds per square mile. But when you get into lower density, wetland densities and lower ducks, you have fewer survey lines. But typically, the survey lines only account for 1% of the land.
Yes.
And we're extrapolating everything between this survey line, number 42 and number 43, and assuming the habitat's the same. Well, that's incredibly dangerous,
Well,
So
keep in mind, too, one thing I like.
So to call this an estimate is probably a stretch. It really probably is an index. So.
And, bringing that up with just your sampling unit and your extrapolation, Thomas has done another. He always has these really neat little components in his talks.
This is Thomas Reike.
Right, Thomas Reike from Missoula there. And he's actually gone through, and, we're counting low thousands of mallards in the survey. And that's getting extrapolated up to 8 million mallards some years. So it's, again, letting people know what this is. I mean, you're counting this, adjusting it by this, and then expanding it by 99% for the 1% of the PP or the breeding duck habitat you covered. And it's a lot of multiplying with variance that it's the best you can do. And just think of the price tag to do that.
Yeah. It's an index.
So we're back. We kind of were waffling. Index all the way back.
Yeah.
No, that's good. So
Now let me
Yeah,
say
go ahead.
one more thing, Joel. You asked, are we ever really surprised? Well, from year to year, probably not. I would say one of the surprises we see, canvasback numbers. Everybody thinks canvasbacks have fallen off the face of the earth, and there used to be millions and millions, and now there's 600,000. If you look at the count of canvasbacks in the trend line, it's flat. It's a remarkably flat line. Okay, so they haven't changed a ton. They're a parkland breeding duck by and large. They don't nest in the prairies where water goes up and down. But what's interesting about Kansas, they'll fluctuate from 900,000 to 500,000 in 1 year. That's an error. That's just flat out an error. And what that probably reflects is canvasbacks have a sex ratio much like mallards and pintails now, and probably have been skewed for a longer period of time. But there's 3 drakes for every 1 hen. And so when those drakes fly back north, okay, if they're a paired male, they're flying with a female canvasback, okay? But when you do the surveys, where are the unpaired males? If they happen to be in the parkland, still hanging out, trying to become a paired male, you're counting them, and all of a sudden you have 900,000 canvasbacks.
Gotcha.
And if the next year the chronology is just a little bit earlier, we don't know a ton about what unpaired males do, but from mallards, where we put transmitters on them, we find they come back, hang around for a little while where they were raised or where they bred last year, and then they bugger off and go north. But if they're there that week you're flying the surveys, they get counted. So we see those fluctuations. But one of the fluctuations we saw over a series of years was the really wet years. And I don't remember, I should know this, when ducks peaked. But the all-time high duck count was like 2013 or in the recently, 10 years
You're
ago.
talking
So.
ponds and CRP was like 07.
And
We
so
had the lag effect for the duck number.
And so we hit a maximum number of ducks, even though we've been counting since 55. And yet everybody in the world knows that pond numbers have continued to decline. We've seen drainage. It's been less bad in the U.S. because we've had regulations since at least the 80s. But in Prairie Canada, there are no farm bill type regulations keeping farmers from draining. And in fact, we haven't even slowed the drainage rates in 30 years in Prairie Canada. And remember, they have 2/3 of the wetlands. And so a fair number of people said, wait a minute, I don't trust this survey. How could we reach maximum duck counts when ponds have clearly declined dramatically since 1955? Well, we had so much water that there was water everywhere. There were ponds that were drained, and yet they were holding water because there was nowhere for the water to drain. And so water can cure all evils on the prairies. And we hit that. But I think that was the start of people being a little bit skeptical about the BPOP survey. So.
Okay. That does kind of get me into the kind of the whole point of this. Poking the bear a little bit, do you think the average duck hunter trusts the survey?
I would say yes. I have no survey results, no human dimension survey, but I think the average duck hunter does. But I think there's 10% out there that don't. And I think that's really exacerbated by social media. Guys say, there's just no ducks in Vermilion Parish, and the survey has to be wrong. Well, it was a weird year last year, and migration was held up, and so you get all this talk on the internet now. So, but I still think most duck hunters trust the survey.
Well, Frank, as somebody, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I don't know your answer, but as someone who literally has dedicated your adult life to waterfowl, do you feel that, two-part question, do you feel that the results or the trustworthiness has changed over time? And then what's your personal stamp on it? Do you trust the survey?
I don't think it's changed very much over time. And I absolutely believe it. I know dozens and dozens of people that work on it that, from my former student, Ken Richkus, that would take a break and go count ducks just so he could get out of D.C. He was in charge of migratory birds, and he'd take a break. And to me, that's pretty remarkable that you have one of the higher paid federal guys out counting ducks, But I've never known anybody that did this that wasn't completely passionate about ducks. And there are people that believe that there's some conspiracy. Well, one, I don't have a lot of faith in the federal government. And for them to pull off a conspiracy that requires that many people would be absolutely impossible. No way that could happen. So, when some internet nuts say that this is conspiracy and they're making up numbers, that's complete bullshit. Now, is it accurate? Well, yeah, no, Chris and I have talked about this is an index and it can be wrong from year to year and we get false indications. Last year the mallard numbers look like, well, they're not that bad. But if you're a hunter in anywhere in the mid-continent, yeah, they were bad because all the mallards were in northern Alberta. Those mallards don't produce babies that come to Arkansas. So you can get misreads by just looking at the total number.
And just like the system change, you were talking about the changes that Thomas and others are working on as well with sex ratio. If things just stayed constant, it would be fine. You can't complain about it at all. Full trust, and it's an index. It's away from truth relatively stably. But when you start getting these system changes in there, such as this female mortality, this increase in female mortality that's changing sex ratios, that's when you got to be creative enough to identify that problem. But then you also got to be creative enough to maybe start incorporating that into a fix.
So Thomas Reiki is the person, and others. Famous biologist Todd Arnold, Ray Alsauskas used Lincoln indicators and found out that, hey, look, sex ratios are dramatically diverging in the last 20, 30 years. And they're getting more male biased. And as Chris pointed out, we strongly believe that's because hens die on the breeding grounds. Juvenile sex ratios, hatchier birds are 1 to 1. Mm-hmm. When you count the adults, that's when you get these crazy skews because adult hens have died nesting. They've been caught by a predator on the nest, and that seems to be getting worse. We haven't incorporated changes in sex ratio. We're still using a sex ratio in the BPOP that's way wrong, in terms of calculating pairs. And so if those lone males are staying around, you're counting them as pairs, and we're probably overestimating duck numbers in recent years. We need to fix that.
Yeah, when I start hearing skeptics like throwing shade on the government, they're lying, and I try to think. I guess I do this with a lot of different things. Like, what would the motivation be? Like, what would they be trying to accomplish? And I think, okay, so if they were lying that the numbers and saying the numbers are really low, you could see that's a conspiracy against hunting. We got to get rid of it. But to bias it high, I could think maybe you're trying to generate license revenue or something like that. But I really can't put, with all that work and all that time and energy, like you just said, and frankly, most of the people that are involved in these surveys, they've dedicated their working career to waterfowl, to conservation, and it just doesn't jive to me.
No, I agree.
Well, anyway, I guess another two more questions. It's been a nice long podcast, and I don't know how we could have shortened it, but the future. So you're looking ahead. Frank, we've been working with drones quite a bit. Standard video cameras, thermal imaging cameras, broods, pairs, getting pretty darn good at it.
Yes.
Flashing forward 10, 20 years, do you see the survey continuing? Do you see more, trends in remote sensing? And
well, remember, you're asking an old guy. So I suspect the aerial part of the survey will continue. I can't imagine that a drone would be effective at flying 150. But the ground counts, to me, would really be easily done by drone. We did some work recently. We, of course, are doing our own research on, the effects of different management strategies. We want to count pairs. And we did a study in the last couple of years where we counted ponds. We selected a whole bunch of ponds, and we did a standard walking count where you walk around and count. And you're trying not to disturb the ducks too much. And then we did a beat out count where you go in and disturb them, and that's where you flush the ducks that you didn't even see. They were in the cattails, and I used to do this with my dog. I just sent my dog in the pond, but what we found is that, and I thought the beat out count would be most accurate, but what we found was most accurate is flying the drone with the thermal imaging, and this drone has both the thermal camera that sees the hot spots, and then you toggle to the visual camera, and you can say, oh, those hot spots are green-winged teal, or that hot spot is a muskrat, who cares? The drone was much more accurate.
And faster.
And what was really cool is it's almost 4 times faster. And so we could cut down on the size of the crews and fly. Now, in Canada, you absolutely have to have permission to fly over people's land. So you still have to get permission, but this has become a real problem in recent years with we're not allowed to trespass anymore to do duck counts, even though it's a big federal survey. And CWS has no ability to go on your land and count ducks without your permission. In the States, it's less onerous, and so you could probably fly a drone and do it much faster and be more accurate. So I suspect the visual correction factors would be improved by using drones. How soon we'll get there, I don't know. As Chris said, these changes take some time. And you wouldn't want to do it like in 1 year, because then all of a sudden the count wouldn't be comparable. And so you'd have to do both for 2 or 3 years to say, okay, the VCFs have gone up, because the drone sees more ducks that the pilot didn't see, and the ground crew didn't used to see them. Now we do see them.
So that would either allow for a correction factor of historical data,
yes,
or correction factor for new
going
data.
forward. Yeah.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. The one thing we also didn't touch about this is, so the BPOP. Yeah, we talk about the regulatory side of it, but Frank, talk about how it informs conservation action, conservation decision making. It's not just about how many ducks do we get to shoot each year.
Absolutely. The BPOP numbers are sort of integrated over several years, and we produce throughout the prairies what they're called thunderstorm maps, just because they have the image that you see on your TV of different shades of color. Like, whoa, damn, it's really raining here, and that's red, and it's blue out here, and it's green out here. You might get a sprinkling. So when we do that, red means, whoa, that's great. From my standpoint, there are a lot of ducks there. In the U.S. side, a thunderstorm map that's red means 100 pairs per square mile, and then it goes down by usually increments of 20. But that really informs management about where you should be spending dollars. So we have a great supporter, a guy named John Childs, who says, I want you to really focus on the high density areas and go out and try and secure easements to protect the wetlands. And so, and we're using the thunderstorm map to do that. Well, that's all based on years of BPOP data. So.
Yeah. Well, Chris, we select research project study areas, on the duck production side.
Yep.
That helps us determine where we're going to put a trap site.
Yep.
We want to impact the maximum number of pairs possible. So we go right to those reds. A little, I don't know, on the weather side, I don't like red. Last night, did you guys have hail at your place? I had hail at my place.
No.
I was looking at
it all went a little bit east of us.
Oh, yeah, it got me. All that red. I was like, this is not good.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you, guys. I want to give you an opportunity to just present some closing thoughts. Anything you thought that maybe we missed that you wanted to talk about?
I think it's just, keep in mind, for, legalized duck hunting, participating when you can is good. The banding stuff is huge. The harvest surveys is really big as well. And, it's a lot of citizen science data, but just, help out when you can, report bands, help with the wing bee, sending in wings, stuff like that. And, if you have questions, I'd be really surprised if you can't get an answer from a duck biologist. As we've mentioned many times, I mean, the federal guys, and they're into this, and they've been doing it. Some younger guys might not have the history, but they're into it. They'd be happy to talk about it and walk you through, all these components and how they get used for a duck season. Like, for example, just the hip stuff, it's learn a little bit more. It's not what you answer when you buy your license. It actually goes way past that. So
the one thing that you probably have plans for a whole separate podcast, but we've talked only about May surveys. And that's one way of enumerating populations. And we have two other methods that rarely get mentioned. And one are Lincoln estimators. And what's funny is Lincoln estimators for many wildlife populations are by far the most accurate ways to estimate numbers of animals. And it requires you mark some animals and then you later come back. And so, you let's do in my backyard, I catch 10 mice and mark them, and then I come back later and I catch 10 more, but only 2 of them have markers. And so 8 out of 10 are not marked. So you could extrapolate to the population, assuming that, 10 is that, 20%. And so, have a much larger population. That's a real simple Lincoln estimator. This Frederick Lincoln developed this thing, the same guy that was the biologist that said we should be using airplanes to count ducks. Well, recently people have picked up on Lincoln estimators, and God knows why it took us so long. But this now has a history of about 25 years. Ray Alasauskas, Todd Arnold, and what's interesting is those Lincoln estimators tracked the BPOP for a while quite precisely. They were higher, but they tracked. And then all of a sudden they kind of quit tracking. Well, that makes us nervous. And then the other thing is even less well-known survey, and it's only on the U.S. side, which is unfortunate, but there's a Fish and Wildlife Service office called HAPIT, Habitat and Population Evaluation Team. But they do a different type of survey where they send individuals out and they count individual wetlands, and they monitor the type of wetland, and then they can extrapolate. And they did this largely for research purposes, but those 4 square mile surveys are really useful. And what we need to do is integrate them. And I hate to keep going back to, these great waterfowl biologists like Arnold and Dave Coons and Thomas Reike. But Thomas has been interested in, let's see how these 3 different survey methods line up and why are they different. And so that's a really cool aspect. And those are different types of surveys and worthy of future podcasts. But I think that's cool stuff.
Well, Thomas, if you're listening to this podcast, start thinking about how to simply describe very complex thoughts and processes, and we'll get you on here.
Yeah.
How's that? Frank, I think in closing, I think it's important for duck hunters. We've talked about, we've addressed, do our duck numbers a lie? And I would say we've said no. We've talked about the science, we talked about the history, we've talked about skeptics, and I think we've told the truth. I really do. But if a duck hunter had 30 seconds with a congressman or a senator, and they had 30 seconds to talk to them about why the BPOP and all these other surveys are important, what would you have them say?
Oh, I'd have them say, look, you can't manage a population, and you particularly can't hunt it unless you know that you're doing no harm. And the BPOP is our way of tracking trends in population and understanding the relationship between harvest and population size. So it's essential, in my opinion. So, and have great faith. It's one of the greatest wildlife surveys in the world. So, we are very fortunate in the waterfowl world to have great data, as Chris mentioned, banding data to inform us both about populations and about harvest and harvest data that comes from hunters, where you're asked to tell the service how many ducks you shoot, and sometimes you're asked to actually provide a wing so that they know what the composition of the harvest is, and the sex ratios and age ratios. And the BPOP is certainly one of the most important things. So stress that this is a really important resource. Hunters really care about the animals that they're out there chasing. We all love ducks. I know very few hunters that hunt ducks that don't love them and want to conserve them. So it's important.
You went more than 30 seconds.
Did I? I'm sorry.
No. And I guess for future conversations, again, we've collected a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, a lot of social media comments about just poor duck seasons.
Yeah.
So I just want to bring the listener back to 2 episodes ago. We talked about duck distribution, a complex problem of just think of the continental magnitude, of waterfowl conservation. And so we did our best to unpack a series of 5 different topics, all contributing to what we think are bad duck seasons,
Yes.
but also great duck seasons, right? And so I would encourage people to go back to that. And I think this one fits nicely in there, just kind of understanding maybe it's hunter expectations and regulations. That was one of the pillars, maybe a little duck production in there, a little habitat conservation. So this one really spans those duck distribution topics. Chris, give you a chance for any part?
I'd say the same thing, is just support these data, gathering efforts. Without data, you're not able to justify what we're doing. If you're not participating and helping us lock in that what we're doing is not impacting these populations, it opens a hole that we could lose it. So again, support these tools that help us justify what we're all really into, healthy populations and having fun, making memories, stuff like that.
There you go. Can't top that.
Nope.
With that, thanks, guys.
Enjoyed it.
All right.
It was fun.
Next time. See ya.